My name is Bruce Magid. My circumnavigation was 1972. I was the second circumnavigator, and the topic was to understand and evaluate the perception of Americans, US culture, and the US economy abroad. So I went to the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and I was studying international relations with, let's call it, a major focus on political economy. The chapter of the club that sponsored me was the New York chapter. Ray Dinsmore's, one of the founders, was I think the chapter that started this whole circumnavigation. I was very interested in trying to understand, remember this is an era without internet, what factors would influence people's perceptions of the United States? Because I had heard stories of soldiers when they came back and tourists when they came back, and I was wondering if that was what people thought the US society was all about. In terms of the countries that I visited, I started out in Japan, and then I went on to Taiwan. And from there, I went to Singapore, and up the peninsula, I went to Malaysia, I went to Thailand, I went on to Nepal, Afghanistan, India, Iran, across to Turkey. I'm sorry, I left out the Philippines, Turkey. Then I hit Europe, starting out with all of at that time, communist countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Went on to Germany, Austria. Then I went down to Morocco and ended up in Spain and Portugal. And I've left out a couple. Oh, I went to Iran, left Iran out, sorry. But altogether 23. On the plane going to Japan, and I met this student, and we started talking and started explaining to me about their impression of the United States, studying in the United States, and started explaining to me that it was important for me to go to Japan because Japan was going to rule the world economically. And I should get to know the younger generation because I'll eventually go to work for them. And so when I landed there, they made it a point to take me around and, so to speak, take me under their wings, because they said in the next 20 years, I'll need these contacts as Japan becomes the most powerful nation in the world. So I landed in Tokyo, my first stop, and there was a sense of cultural bewilderment and shock, not speaking the language. Fortunately, I had met somebody on the plane who had written in Japanese the hotel to go to. I went to the hotel, and I tried to explain to the clerk that I wanted to go to the main shopping area. And he called a cab, and the cab driver dropped me off at the McDonald's, which had just opened. And, kind of like, well, here you are, you're an American, you need to go to McDonald's. And that was my first impression. But then when I met the Japanese people, they had a sense that Americans did not understand Japanese culture. And I said, oh, I'm young, I'm open-minded, I'm very willing to understand. And the first place they took me to was to a raw seafood restaurant where they chopped the seafood in front of me. And I sat down and I ate it. And they said, well, good, if you're willing to try our food and our cuisine, you're willing to learn about our culture. And then, of course, I did take the obligatory bullet train ride to see the temples and the majesty of the culture. At the same time, this was 1972, and people were saying that they aspired to be like the United States in terms of economic power, but there was still the residual about Americans, the military presence, and a sense of American entitlement after winning the war. So it was an interesting experience from a cultural perspective, but yet the people feeling that the United States did not respect their culture and felt they were superior. When I landed in Taiwan, in Taipei, I was struck by how dirty and how the city was not modern. At that time, downtown Taipei was dirt roads and children playing on the streets and dogs running. And I was surprised because I was under the impression that it was an emerging democracy and economic power. And I spoke to people, and they said, "Well, just wait. We're determined. We're highly educated. We're going to be sending lots and lots of students to the United States. They're going to come back. We're going to have strong ties with the U.S. Just wait and see." So I was surprised, if you will, by that initial experience. But yet I also found I took the train all the way to the, if you will, southern tip of which, depending which direction you're going, of Taiwan. They had a train, and in the countryside, as soon as you left Taipei, it was still thatched huts and roofs. And my experience, if I may, I got off the train at one point. Nobody spoke English, and nobody seemed to take tickets or anything. And I was hungry, and I walked down this path and stopped in front of a thatched hut, and I thought it was a restaurant because there were a couple of tables in front of it, and I sat down, and somebody came out, and I kind of did my rubbing of my stomach, and they took me to the back, and there was some cauldrons there, and they opened them up, and one had steaming rice, and another one had pineapple, and another one had shrimp with cashew nuts. And I pointed to all of them and went and sat down and had this wonderful meal. And they came out and they brought me tea, and I ate, and couldn't really communicate, but we were communicating by eyes. And at the end of the meal, they came out and they bowed, and I took out my wallet, and they looked at me strangely, and they just smiled. And I went back on the train, and as I was riding the train, I said, "I think I just went to somebody's home." And it just showed how wonderful and friendly the people were. And so I honestly, as I look back on that, I had one of the most wonderful meals of my life. But to me, it just showed the warmth of the people, and they were just, I couldn't communicate by words, but I communicated by eyes, and maybe that's part of that whole experience. When you go abroad, you begin to communicate not just in terms of how you speak, but there's a way and an understanding that you get from being with people face to face. Hong Kong was a very interesting country to visit. There was a lust to be part of the US capitalism, respect for Americans, dislike of the Americans' lack of culture and couth, I might say, but they were tending to overlook that. Clearly, in terms of the military presence, they viewed that as vital to their security, because they always, the business people, the educated people I talked to, always, so to speak, had one foot in Hong Kong and one foot out the door, waiting for something to happen. So they really were looking to the United States to, if you will, protect, quote unquote. Because when I landed in the Philippines, most people didn't speak English, and I speak Spanish, and I was surprised to see that there was still a number of people who spoke Spanish. And from there, the conversation went to, well, the United States liberated us, saved us during World War II. And so we're very appreciative of the United States for all that you've done. And the military presence was viewed more as a positive than a negative, whereas in so many countries it was a negative, rowdy GIs on leave. But yet at the same time, I just really spent all my time in Manila. You had a sense of the stark difference between the haves and the have-nots, and a sense of the younger people of a desire to leave the Philippines and come to the United States. No matter who I spoke to, didn't really view wanting to be part of the Philippines' future. They were more interested in the United States and moving to the United States and becoming part of US society. So an interesting experience, different than some of the other countries. Again, the starkness on the political side, not much discussion about the country's governance structure, whereas in other countries it was more about the people trying to find a way for them to get ahead in terms of, I would say, economically. So in terms of my time in Singapore and comparing it to Hong Kong or even Taiwan, I was struck by the fact that the city was so clean and so regimented in the sense that everybody seemed to do what they were told to do and how they did it. I remember being there right near the Raffles Hotel and speaking to somebody in the shanties were being bulldozed. And I said, well, where do the people go to live? And they said, oh, the government has just built housing for them. They'll be given a key. They'll be given a unit to go to, and they will be told what their job will be and where to go. And and I said, my goodness. And they said, that's right. We're very regimented. We know what we want to do. We want to have a modern society. Don't spit on the sidewalk. Don't chew gum and throw it. Those are all violations. So it was the impression was of a clean city. And even though it wasn't a dictatorship, very carefully regulated in terms of people's behavior and conduct. But it was clear even then that this was going to be a city state that was going to be modern, powerful, open to U.S. business, and I had the sense that comparing it to Hong Kong, where you have this energy and kind of unbridled energy, that Singapore was going to be more regulated and at the end of the day would probably emerge more as a Western financial hub than Hong Kong. So a contrast in cultures and in many ways over the way the government was run. Yes, when I went to Malaysia, first I started out in Kuala Lumpur, and then I went out the countryside to a very beautiful remote island at the time called Penang, which is now a manufacturing base for industry. And I went up a tram, and I was walking. It was getting towards sunset, and I stopped and I looked at this mosque, and a man came up to me and he said, "That's the Magid." And I said, "Well, that's my last name." And he said, "Well, you're here to find your destiny." And for the next 3 hours, he talked to me about my destiny, and that his hope for the world was that more people would visit each other's countries and get to know each other, because that would be important if we were going to strive toward world peace. He also said to me, knowledge is like an ocean, and you never touch the shore. And he went on and started giving me this sermon or insight on my life and values. And I felt like I was a student and he was a scholar. And I went to his home, and humble home, for tea, and he had Encyclopedia Britannicas that he ordered. And it was just the most amazing experience where he gave me insights into my life, my future, what needed to be done to have a moral society. And it was just, I still shiver when I think about that experience. And I must say that at the end, as I walked back to the tram, suddenly it was dark. It was the two of us. And I became frightened. And I said, what if he was going to rob me? And I became ashamed. And I said, those were my cultural values coming out, where there was this kind, gentle man who just wanted to teach me. So it was quite an experience. So my time in Thailand, there was clearly an absolute monarchy. And I would say that at that time, of course, Bangkok was not the city it is today, where all of the, everything's been paved over, all of the wonderful canals. My sense talking to the people was a deep respect and love for the monarchy, and viewed the monarchy as an important part of the culture. I think they viewed the United States as lacking culture, but at the same time, appreciative of American might, not quite understanding what was going on in Vietnam, the US perspective. But overall, in terms of my sense was that there was not any overt that I could see young people or older people against the monarchy, but more part of the culture, the deep culture and appreciation and the history. So, and I didn't feel in any way that people felt inhibited in terms of what they could say, though in retrospect, everybody had nice things to say about the monarchy. So perhaps that in and of itself is a clue. Well, my time in India was, of course, fascinating. And remember, this is now 1972. And my first impression was of the overwhelming poverty and the overwhelming number of people. Seeing cows run through the main street and yet seeing people starving to death was startling. At the same time, viewing the culture was so rewarding and appreciative, that it was a contradiction, if you will, between a rich culture and a poor country. I did get to travel, and I went to Taj Mahal, and at that time the Taj was really almost in a field by itself, not surrounded by buildings. And I had the most magnificent, one of the top five views of my life, looking at the Taj Mahal over a full moon at night. It was absolutely glorious and almost an out of the body experience. Just absolutely lovely. Well, my time in Nepal, oh my goodness, what a positive experience in terms of the richness of the culture and the people, and touring Nepal, and just the most beautiful people, and soft and gentle and kind, and caring, and just having the opportunity to experience their culture. Really, Nepal at that time, they didn't know anything about Americans other than the hippies that they saw. So they thought everybody in the United States must be a hippie who's traveling with a backpack and has a long hair and smokes a lot of marijuana. So I did get to speak to a few people who spoke English, mainly university people, and they were, so to speak, delighted to see that there were some Americans who actually studied at universities and were not smoking dope the whole time. But I would say there, the appreciation of the culture and the people, and while it's a poor country, it's so rich in terms of its culture and civilization. Very positive experience. The trip to Afghanistan was, when I look back, probably the most fascinating of all of the 23 countries I visited. I went to Afghanistan because I had read in my history books, and when we talked about civilization and economy, how the Afghan people were very proud people and had never submitted, if you will, themselves to foreign intervention. So it was really a country that was unknown to me, but I was very interested in it. I went to Kabul. And when I arrived in Kabul, I was greeted actually by someone. There was a yellow bus, and they said, an American, we are starting our very first tourism activity for the government. And how would you like to take a tour through the countryside where you can learn all about the culture firsthand, experience the people, our values, our religion? And the picture that you have of me is exploring through the countryside and listening to the people. And most fascinating, having the people explain how proud they are and that they will never, ever agree to be subdued by any outside force in civilization. And at that time, we were thinking about the Russians. And so that's the pictures that you see of me outside in the countryside, really getting to experience. So when I visited Iran, I landed in Tehran, and I thought to myself, this is a modern city. It's clean. The people were educated. It seemed like a Chicago surrounded by snow-capped mountains. And everywhere I went, people said that the economy was vibrant. The Shah was beloved. It was just the association with the United States was strong and will always be strong and vital and vibrant. And then I got on a bus and I went to the interior. And as I went further and further away from Tehran, the modern part of the economy went away, and you saw poverty. And talking to people, you had a very different impression, an impression of the people who could speak English, that the Shah and his elite ruled for themselves, and they weren't benefiting society. That the Western culture was corroding the religious views of the people, and that though they didn't say they disliked the United States. They implied that if the United States was an ally of the Shah, that was a problem. So you saw two different worlds, both in terms of luxury and poverty, and two emerging different opinions, which when the Shah was deposed was not surprising to me because of my time in the countryside. Well, my time in Turkey was fascinating because is it part of the East? Is it part of the West? Is it a mix? My impression of talking to Turkey was there was a desire to benefit from the United States, its economy, its wealth, but at the same time maintain its Eastern perspective and its Eastern roots. And there, I think there was a cultural clash over the way Americans, perhaps they thought Americans viewed the world and how they viewed the world. And so you had a very different perspective depending who you're talking to. The business people were, so to speak, all in with the West, and the intellectuals in the university and even some of the students were concerned about Western influence in culture. So it was an interesting mix that the combination, you couldn't quite tell what direction it would end up being in. And I think that sort of explains a sense of, I think they felt that the United States and Western Europe viewed them as inferior to the other countries, and that they wanted to be recognized for their culture, their values. I had quite an interesting experience with the authorities in Bulgaria. I was on the campus of Sofia University interviewing students when suddenly I was picked up by two heavy-set gentlemen in trench coats and dragged off to the Ministry of Justice, where I was subject to an inquisition and saying to me that free speech and communication is not allowed in their country. I was then told by the minister that they had warned the US Embassy that the next incident of unauthorized contact would result in imprisonment of the individual involved. I looked at her and I pleaded and I said, I'm just a 21-year-old student here trying to understand the culture and go back and talk about how wonderful each of the countries are. And I hope I can return with good thoughts and good memories of your country. Well, that kept me out of jail, but they then confined me to my a room in a house. And the next morning I was picked up at 6 a.m. They had taken my passport. And as the train approached, one of these heavy-set gentlemen walked toward me, handed me my passport, pushed me onto the train and said, never come back. So I had quite an experience that I will never forget. The Romanians tended to be more outgoing and egregious and proud of their culture and really looking to tell people more about them, a sense of, Romania is different than Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, and let us explain why. But yet at the same time, remember, it was a part of the Soviet bloc, and so there was a desire, if you will, to they had to be careful, but to reestablish their own individual identity. But I would say in general, I found the people to be friendly, proud, but with that secret hunger to reestablish their own national identity that they thought they were being robbed of as part of the Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia, I found the people to be quite open, and even though it was quote unquote a Soviet country, it seemed to be more open than other countries. Depending where you were in Yugoslavia, it was not a nation state. It was an amalgamation of different cultures and societies, and there was conversation about, Yugoslavia, is this just a state that was developed and put in place by the United States, and we're our own independent people, depending where you are. But so it was very interesting going from region to region and appreciation of the culture, and I think that the sense that I got was that they certainly didn't want to be part of the Soviet bloc, but I never got the sense that they viewed themselves as a proud independent nation state the way other countries did. So perhaps it's not surprising that split up into a number of countries. It was clearly an invention of Tito and the Russians for looking back at it. But people were much more open, friendly, I think felt less endangered than, let's say, in Bulgaria or Romania or Poland. In terms of the Eastern Bloc in association with the Soviet Union, in terms of a positive, not really, perhaps a sense that they had access to education, but in general, people seemed glum and despondent about the situation. I didn't have anybody who said, this is wonderful, and I just hope my children and grandchildren can have the same experience that I had. So in terms of my experiences in Czechoslovakia, and actually in all of the countries, it was a great, if you will, wishing silently that these countries could be part of the Western Bloc. There was an admiration for the US, but a great fear of Russia. So people spoke in very guarded terms, but it was very clear that there was a real desire for democracy, and that it would be bubbling up at some point. And the younger generation in particular said, we're not going to remain a part of this bloc forever. We aspire to democracy. We aspire to freedom. So it was a fascinating foreshadow of what would come very soon. So the Hungarians were, my impression of the Hungary and the Hungarians were a vivacious people with a thirst for life and enjoyment, but at the same time feeling very constrained by the government that had been imposed upon them, and a desire, if you will, to somehow become part of a more Western culture. So almost a sadness and hidden in their lightheartedness and zest for life. So the time in Poland was a fascinating time from the perspective of a country that still had the scars of World War II and was now dominated by Russia. And when you spoke to the Polish people, a pride in being Polish, but yet almost a sense of resignation of constantly being, if you will, invaded, and a desire to have people appreciate, if you will, the culture and secretly move away, I think, from foreign influence, whether it was German or Soviet in terms of military intervention, and be part of the West defined as the United States. There was still a weariness about Germany. So Polish people really, in many ways, demonstrated a resilience, but a concern about their future, particularly being part of the Soviet bloc and memories of Germany. So I would say in general, it was, so to speak, a sad culture because of everything that had happened to them, and a desire to have stronger ties with the United States, and not the same concept of the ugly American that you found in Western Europe. Unfortunately, I was not able to visit the East at that time. So my time was spent in West Germany and West Berlin. It was actually the time of the Olympics as well. But it was fascinating talking to the German people about both their view of the United States and in a wish for reunification. It was interesting because the older generation, you could see there was still resentment toward the United States for the war and what had happened, whereas the younger population was much more focused on the future and talking about their wish for Germany to become a strong, vibrant economy. I took the picture that you see in Austria to represent the culture and civilization. So, of course, when one is traveling, particularly after traveling through Eastern Europe, and suddenly one gets to Western Europe, one is struck by the rich history and culture of Europe. And that was an important aspect of my trip, because folks were talking about the United States at that time, saying you're rich, you're powerful, but you don't have the culture. You don't have the history that we do. And that's why I took that picture there as emblematic of the rich culture and heritage of Europe. So, of course, when arriving in Spain, because I could communicate in Spanish, meant that my opportunity to speak to more people was open to me. And so as opposed to some of the other countries where I did have to speak to university people, government people who spoke English, in Spain, I could go more and venture and speak to the common man and woman, if you will, and get their impressions of the United States and what they thought about the United States. And so I think it gave me a little bit more of a window into the mindset of people. And maybe because it was such a tourist destination, the ugly American image came out very strong in Spain. I would say that as opposed to so many other countries, there was the aspiration to move to the United States. Here, there was, what's wrong with the Americans is the lack of culture and a lack of appreciation of our culture. So it was interesting from a cultural immersion perspective to see how they viewed the United States in the ugly American image. Franco was still in power at that time, and I did not really talk to many people about politics because they didn't want to talk about politics. So just what you're going, whereas in the communist countries, of course, you couldn't. I think maybe people could have, but there was a reluctance to talk about politics other than talk about, they want to live their life and be free. So, I didn't sense a overt openness to discuss the dictatorship. Some people speaking to me did mention that they wish that the past had been different in terms of World War II and alliances and the government's position, but not much conversation. When the conversation would move toward politics, people would steer it away toward culture and dancing and being lively. So in that sense, people were less, as opposed to in Germany or Portugal, people were guarded. So that might have been the instance. And there were police everywhere. So it wasn't quite like communist bloc, but it was very clear that there was strong government control. So I guess in that sense, there's a bit of why I just said that we didn't really talk politics because nobody wanted to talk. The photo that I included was halfway between Spain and Morocco, passing by the Rock of Gibraltar, and I was on the boat and moving on from Europe to Morocco, and kind of waiting and anticipating arriving in Morocco. So that's the picture in halfway between in the Straits of Gibraltar. Morocco, unfortunately, was the only African country I visited. As you might know, you had a certain number of miles on the Pan American Around the World trip. And I was anxious to hit as many countries as I could and focused on Asia and Europe. So that was the only African country. And of course, my impression landed there in the capital, which was a modern city, but then went down to Casablanca and Marrakesh and had a completely different experience, both from a cultural perspective and also, quite candidly, an experience of finding European women who had been kidnapped and were in cages and basically available for sale. I had somebody come up to me and they said, would you like to meet, some Moroccan, some young people, something to that effect. I don't remember. And I was led into this underground, I don't want to say cave, but tunnel. And I saw these women in cages. And the man said to me, would you like to buy one? And I didn't know what to do. I was extremely afraid. My first thought was to call the police, but then I said, that's probably not a good idea. They're probably paid off. My second thought was, what happens if I don't? Will they kill me? And then I felt terrible for all the young girls. And I said, well, maybe I should buy one and free them. But I said, well, yeah, I'm interested, but I left my money in the hotel. So I'll come back later. And I never went to the police because I was afraid if I went to the police, I'd be indicted. And I always felt guilty that I never did anything, but it was a shock to see firsthand what you read about in terms of the sex trade and slavery. Portugal was near the end of my trip, and so because perhaps it was near the end of my trip, I was relaxed and thought I could speak Spanish, and it was just a lovely, vibrant country with wonderful people, and it was almost kind of a relaxation at the end of the trip. And I found the people friendly and outgoing, love for life, happy and content in general, wanting and aspiring to be more of a developed Western nation, and happy to sit down and have wine and snacks and share their views openly. And having been in the Eastern Bloc for so long, it was such a delightful experience to have people just be completely open and at ease, and enjoying life. We just talked about Poland and how people were so sullen, and the Portuguese were just so happy and wanting to, thought they had a bright future, and were happy and content in general with what they had at the time. That's a picture. The picture that you have is the staffer holding up the map of the world as I'm getting ready to go on my trip. And in fact, I still have that map, and smiling and pointing to me all the different places. And at that time, I was not dressed as well as everybody else on the plane, I must admit. Traveling was still something where people went in, very elegant clothing in general, and the Pan Am attendants were wonderful and attentive, and the whole time. And I met them, and they would speak to me, and I just have to say, I remember one incident. They were so nice. I had purchased in an antique fair, let's say in India, a beautiful, it's a carved knife that it has like a knife on one end and a prong on another. And every time I got on the plane, I would meet the stewardess and I would be talking to them. And I showed them on this flight, this beautiful, they said, "Oh, you need to show the pilot. This is amazing." And I walked up to the front, and the pilot opened the door, and I took out my beautiful antique with a knife and a prong. I said, "Look at this." And I'm holding it up with my hand. And they said, "Oh, wow, isn't that great?" I said, "Isn't it?" And they just said, "That is superb. Let me see it." So today I'd probably still be in jail. But so I think that everybody on Pan American, when they found out I was part of that Pan American around the world trip, were gracious as they could be, and kind and supportive. And it's just a shame Pan Am doesn't exist, and that around the world trip doesn't exist. So there you go. How many people now could go up to the pilot, open the door, and show them a knife, and have the pilot stand up and say, "That's so wonderful. Thank you for sharing." And by the way, being able to bring it on the plane. Well, I think in terms of being brave in your choices and seeking the unknown, when you first get on that plane and you're leaving, in this case, JFK, and going to Japan, and suddenly you're 21 years old and you don't know anybody, and you have 2 or 3 contacts, and you have no cell phone and no computer, you have to kind of say to yourself, okay, let me be brave. Let me not be afraid of the unknown. Let me embrace it. At the same time, not be stupid. A couple of times I was stupid, and it almost cost me. But you have to develop a sense of self-confidence, but also being careful, knowing the boundaries. You can't just be lackadaisical. So you have to approach each country that you are a foreigner, and understand, if you will, the lurking concerns, and at the same time not be afraid to venture, if that makes sense. And I think with each country I went to, I was better prepared. So having gone to Afghanistan after 6 or 7 countries prepared me a little bit better for the unknown, and avoided some of the incidents that could have happened. I mean, I just remember in Afghanistan, they said in the culture, when we were out on the trip, and there were 4 of us in a room at night, and they said, "Well, here's the culture. Each one of you is going to have to take a shift, because there's no lock on the doors, and people will open the door, and if you're asleep, they will rob you and maybe kill you, but that's just the way it is. So make sure you're on shifts at 3 hours at a time. And there I was, and when it was my shift, somebody opened the door and I screamed and they went away. Um, okay, is that kind of embracing fear and but still dealing with it? You were told in advance what was going to happen, and yet I didn't go to sleep and I stayed awake, and I lived to tell the story. Well, when you think about the difference in global travel between the 70s and now, the first thing that sticks out is the ability to research in advance where you're going and study a bit more. I mean, I basically didn't know very much about any of the 23 countries. It was limited information. The second point is that you're connected still to the United States. I mean, when I was traveling, I had no cell phone, no computer. I called my parents one time from Iran. So you're completely immersed in the culture. I think nowadays everybody has their, you know, internet on, and you're not really, you stay connected to where you came from instead of being able to focus on where you are for the moment. Another big difference, of course, is that, you know, the world is smaller. I mean, so many people now have traveled around the world. The English is sort more ubiquitous. People know a lot more about the United States through the internet than they did. So I think in some ways it's beneficial, but in some ways it's a shame, because you stay connected to the people you know, the culture you know, where you're from, instead of being able to focus intensely on where you are for the moment. By having the opportunity to visit 23 countries, you really have a chance to dive into comparing and contrasting what are the major factors that influenced other countries' perceptions of the United States. In countries where there was a heavy US military presence, that was a major factor. In countries where there was more of a business presence, that was a major factor. In countries where it was just more American hippies, that was a major factor. So the opportunity to visit 23 countries around the world really gives you an opportunity to compare and contrast, as opposed to if you just go to one country and say, oh, now I get it. I understand what the world thinks of the United States. This is, you know, it's fast paced. Doing 23 countries in 90 days, so to speak, is breathtaking, but it also has a lot of value. So the impact of me on my circumnavigation the following year was that in the classroom, I could comment from a personal perspective when we started speaking about international relations. And that was part of the mission, that the individual would go back and enrich the classroom experience by saying, I just talked too much. I'd like to think that having been overseas enriched the conversation that took place in the classroom, because we had a student who could speak from a personal perspective. Well, the circumnavigation whetted an appetite that I always had for international travel and an international career. And so when I graduated from Georgetown, I knew I wanted to be in that sphere of international relations. And so I went from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is almost like doubling down on international. But I knew I wanted that. And I went to the Fletcher School, and I became keenly interested in economic and social development. And surprisingly, even though I hadn't really visited the region, Latin America, maybe because I spoke Spanish and I hadn't been there in the trip, and pursued a career in international relations as an international economist, and later an international business person, and then the second career in higher education with a focus on international. So when I finished my studies at Fletcher, I went on for my PhD, my doctorate. And so I needed to do field research, and was fortunate enough to have met the Minister of Planning of Venezuela, and arrived in Venezuela. And the minister said, okay, you can do your thesis in the evening and work for me as un asesor, an advisor, during the day. And so I worked in the Ministry of Planning for 2 years on economic and policy planning, and then started as an economist for Bank of America in Caracas, eventually in Brazil, and became the director of international economics and policy research, where interestingly enough, I had responsibility for 35 countries. And going back to my circumnavigator days, I think the fact that I had visited most of them was of great help. I always had planned, and I think in part because of my circumnavigator's trip, to leave private international sector and go into higher education. And then over the course of 20 years, I was involved at Michigan State, San Jose State, and then Brandeis, really as a dean at the last two universities. And at Brandeis, it was called the International Business School. Again, based on my circumnavigation, a belief that the best way that people understand each other is to collaborate together and study overseas, whether it's international students in the United States or US students traveling overseas. So that's what I did. And then my last current career is the CEO of something called the Union Sports, which is a global sports social media platform started by my son, who's more tech savvy than I am. But it's absolutely amazing. It translates into 14 languages to see the Russian goalkeeper talking to goalkeepers around the world on the techniques that are used in Russia, and then having somebody from Brazil chatting with them on the difference. So here's an example of now social media and the internet kind of shrinking those global boundaries. I was a kid from a middle-class family that had never traveled overseas, wanted to travel overseas, did not think I'd ever get the opportunity to travel overseas. And I think the first thing that happened was, because I had been on this trip, it provided, if you will, the basis for me to go to graduate school and get admitted to the school that I wanted to go to. And become truly an internationalist. And from there, a thirst to travel from leisure, a thirst to meet people, whether it's on a business level or just a cultural level. I mean, for me, a pastime, I was part of the International Diplomacy Council in San Francisco. I'm part of the San Diego Diplomacy Council. And we just went last week to a group of young professionals from Uzbekistan who came to visit San Diego. To me, that's a good time. So it just a lifelong interest in other people's cultures, perspectives, and not just from the business or the academic. So it really shaped me into the person that I am. And I think, frankly, when you're exposed to other cultures, you become a better person because you become more open-minded and more liberal in the sense of understanding other people. And perhaps as the US becomes a melting pot, that's something that everybody could use a little bit of. So my advice for future scholars would be to not be locked into your trip destination and goals, to have the flexibility that when you meet new people or experience new opportunities, that don't say, I have to get to the computer and write up such and such, to so to speak, go with the flow, because it's all about learning about the cultures. It's all about learning yourself. So be flexible, be open, and take advantage of these opportunities that will arise unexpectedly and embrace them. The circumnavigation had the greatest impact in my life of any experience I've ever had. And, I really thought that I was traveling to learn about other cultures, other people, and their views about themselves. But I returned learning more about myself than I ever knew. I learned my own biases, my own inner strengths and weaknesses. I learned what I wanted to do in life. It solidified my core values of what I thought. It opened my eyes to other cultures and values, and it was a transformational experience. So I think the takeaway from the circumnavigation experience is not the research project and that you come back with. You're a 21-year-old kid. It's the impact on you. And that's why when I went into higher education, I've been such a fervent advocate of helping others get some sort of experience like that. As I look back on the 50th anniversary, I'm really proud, and I think was fortunate that I was one of the first uh, people to travel. I mean, as I always joked, I said, well, Greg came back alive, so I guess that was a good one to be second. I mean, it works. I think it's a fabulous program. I think that it's evolved over time of necessity with the internet, et cetera. I think that when I look at the research quality of the projects being done today, mine appears to be kindergarten versus PhD work. Um, but I think at the same time, I hope that the current students, when they're doing their research, don't get so immersed in research that they forget what I think is still the overriding goal for them to experience other cultures and to experience themselves. So I'm pleased that it continues. I see it evolves over time the way it has, but I do hope that the roots, the original vision of the founders, Ray Dainsmore and others, remains in place, that it's an opportunity to experience the world, experience yourself, and conduct some research. Well, first of all, it's hard to believe as I start thinking about the trip and taking out my photos that it's been 50 years. So many organizations start with initiatives, and I've seen that both in the private sector and higher education, that kind of wind down after the original founder is no longer able to maintain it. It's more of a personal than an organizational initiative. It's wonderful to see that this has been embraced by so many chapters, which shows real staying power and a commitment to the concept. And I think that's the sustainability is based upon all of the foundations around the country and around the world. And I think that even though the world is connected via the internet and whatever other social media, the opportunity to travel firsthand and travel alone is a unique opportunity, and it is something that the goal should be 50 and 50. It's where I guess we didn't quite get there, but to see how you can continue to expand this opportunity to other universities and maybe some of those that are outside of the mainstream. I mean, I think about I've been in the California State University system. Some of those universities for first gen minority students who have never traveled outside the United States to experience that. So I hope as we move forward, we can even be more, you know, eh, expose more students to this opportunity at other universities. Well, why is it important to continue investing in young people and opportunities like this? Look at in the world we live in today, particularly as the United States and so many other countries turn inward, you need to develop people who have more of an international perspective and an understanding of culture. These are the young leaders of tomorrow, and otherwise we all turn inward, nationalistic. There's a real, I think, danger in that. And the world's problems are global; they're not local. And so the more you can expose young people to become leaders and advocates for global solutions to the problems facing the world, I think the better off the world will be.